What happens when Chicago's most ruthless underworld boss corners an ordinary overweight accountant in a parking garage? A fatal mistake, a hidden ledger, and a terrifyingly cold gaze change everything. Taylor Gallagher was profoundly used to being invisible. At a size 22, she knew how the world worked. To the sleek, tailored corporate sharks at Faulkner and Reed Financial on LaSalle Street, she wasn't a woman. She was a fixture. She was the quiet, heavy-set senior auditor who occupied cubicle 4B, the one who never complained when her desk was piled high with the most tedious corporate tax returns and forensic accounting files. She hid her soft curves beneath oversized cardigans and relied on her razor-sharp intellect to secure her place in a world that demanded physical perfection. It was 11:45 p.m. on a Tuesday. The sprawling office was a graveyard of empty ergonomic chairs and glowing Dell monitors. Taylor rubbed her tired eyes, her glasses sliding down the bridge of her nose as she stared at the sprawling Excel spreadsheet before her. She was auditing the quarterly acquisitions of Frontier Logistics, a supposedly boring supply chain management firm. But for the last 3 hours, a sickening knot had been tightening in her stomach. There was a discrepancy, a massive one. Over $4 million had vanished, routed through a complex web of shell companies registered in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. But it wasn't just the missing money that terrified her. It was the authorization signatures. The dummy accounts were linked directly to her own supervising manager, Jonathan Hayes. Jonathan, the charismatic partner who had mentored her, the man who always brought her a double-shot vanilla latte on Monday mornings, was laundering money. And based on the vendor names, Capone Imports Outfit Holdings, he wasn't laundering it for white-collar executives. He was cleaning cash for the Chicago syndicate. Taylor's breath hitched in her throat. Her plump fingers hovered over the keyboard. If she flagged it, Jonathan would know instantly. If she didn't, her signature on the audit would make her an accessory to federal racketeering. Just print it and get out, she whispered to herself, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hit the print command, waiting agonizingly for the heavy office printer to spit out the incriminating ledgers. Snatching the warm pages, she shoved them into her worn leather tote bag, shut down her workstation, and practically ran for the elevators. The descent to the underground parking garage felt like an eternity. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered, casting long, sickly shadows across the damp concrete. Her footsteps echoed entirely too loudly. She clutched her keys, her knuckles white, weaving between the concrete pillars toward her sensible 2014 Honda Civic. She just had to get home. She would call the FBI in the morning. She would disappear. But as she reached the driver's side door, a massive, dark SUV silently rolled down the ramp, its headlights cutting through the gloom and pinning her against her car like a deer in the crosshairs. The tires screeched softly as it stopped mere feet away, blocking her exit. Taylor froze. The panic was instantaneous, a cold sweat breaking out across her forehead and back. Her breathing grew shallow, her ample chest heaving under her blouse. The heavy doors of the SUV opened. 3 men stepped out. 2 were built like linebackers wearing tailored dark suits that bulged unnaturally at the armpits. But it was the 3rd man who made the blood turn to ice in Taylor's veins. Dominic Castiglione. She recognized him from the society pages and the hushed whispers of the city's elite. He was the heir to the Castiglione crime family, a man who operated in the terrifying gray space between legitimate billionaire and ruthless mob boss. He was breathtakingly tall, wrapped in a wool overcoat that made him look like a shadow brought to life. His face was sculpted with aristocratic cruelty, high cheekbones, a sharp jawline, and eyes as devoid of warmth as a winter grave. He didn't rush. He walked toward her, with the slow, deliberate grace of an apex predator, that knew its prey was already trapped. Taylor pressed her back against the cold metal of her Honda, her hands trembling so violently she dropped her keys. They clattered loudly on the concrete. She squeezed her eyes shut instinctively, trying to make herself smaller, to fold her plus-size frame into the shadows, praying this was a hallucination. "Look at me," a voice demanded. It was a low, gravelly rasp, quiet, but laced with an absolute authority that vibrated through her bones. Taylor kept her eyes squeezed shut, a single tear escaping and tracking down her cheek. She was terrified he was going to shoot her right there. Suddenly, a large, leather-gloved hand gripped her jaw. The touch wasn't painful, but the grip was unyielding. He tilted her face upward. "I said, look at me." The Mafia boss repeated his tone, dropping an octave brooking zero defiance. Trembling, Taylor slowly opened her eyes, forcing herself to meet his cold, dead gaze. Up close, his eyes were a terrifying shade of pale grey, like cracked ice over a deep, dark lake. He didn't look at her with the usual disgust or dismissal she was accustomed to from men of his caliber. He looked at her with analytical precision, dissecting her fear. "Taylor Gallagher," Dominic said, his voice a lethal purr. He released her chin only to reach out and snatch the heavy leather tote bag from her trembling shoulder. "You work late. A dedicated employee." Please," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "I don't know anything. I didn't see anything." Dominic unbuckled her bag and reached inside, pulling out the freshly printed ledgers. He glanced at the top page, the harsh glare of the garage lights illuminating the harsh lines of his face. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "You lie poorly, Taylor," he murmured, his eyes snapping back to hers. "Jonathan Hayes is a dead man walking. He stole from my family, and he used your credentials to cover his tracks. As of right now, the FBI is receiving an anonymous tip that you are the mastermind behind a $4 million embezzlement scheme." Taylor's knees buckled. She would have collapsed onto the dirty concrete if one of the massive bodyguards hadn't stepped forward, grabbing her upper arm to keep her upright. "Jonathan. He set me up." She gasped, the betrayal hitting her just as hard as the terror. She thought of his warm smiles, the coffees, the late-night mentoring sessions. It was all a calculated manipulation to build the perfect, unassuming fall guy. The fat, quiet girl nobody would defend. "He did." Dominic confirmed, his expression unreadable. "My men are currently dealing with Mr. Hayes. But that leaves me with a problem. The money is gone, the feds are circling, and my ledgers are a mess." He stepped closer, invading her personal space. Taylor could smell his cologne, something expensive, sharp and smelling faintly of cedar and smoke. She felt hyper-aware of her body, of her soft stomach and thick thighs, standing before a man who looked like a dark god. "You have two choices," Dominic stated, his pale eyes holding her captive. "You can stay here, wait for the police, and spend the rest of your life in federal prison for crimes you didn't commit. Or you can get in the car." "Get in the car," she echoed numbly. "You found the anomaly in 3 hours. My accountants couldn't find it in 3 months." Dominic said, a flicker of dark respect passing through his gaze. "You are going to fix my books, Taylor. You are going to trace my money. And in return, I will ensure you stay out of a cage." He didn't wait for her answer. He turned and walked back toward the SUV. The bodyguard gripping her arm gave her a gentle but firm shove forward. Taylor looked back at her little Honda, a symbol of her small, safe, invisible life. That life was over. Taking a shuddering breath, she walked toward the black SUV, stepping willingly into the dark. The transition from the bleak, damp concrete of the parking garage to the opulent, terrifying silence of Dominic Castiglione's Gold Coast penthouse was a jarring blur. Taylor sat rigidly on the edge of a custom-made white velvet sofa that probably cost more than her college tuition. The sheer scale of the apartment was dizzying. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic god's-eye view of Lake Michigan and the glittering Chicago skyline. It was a beautiful cage, but a cage nonetheless. For the past 48 hours she hadn't left the penthouse. Her only company had been a stoic, heavily armed man named Lorenzo, who stood by the elevator, and a rotating delivery of high-end takeout that she had been too nauseous to eat. Dominic had set up a massive mahogany dining table as her temporary workstation, outfitting it with top-of-the-line encrypted laptops and stacks of physical ledgers. "You haven't eaten?" A voice broke the heavy silence. Taylor jumped, knocking a red pen onto the Persian rug. Dominic emerged from the hallway. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing a black dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and faded black ink. "I'm not hungry," she lied, keeping her eyes glued to the laptop screen. In truth, her stomach was in knots. She was painfully aware of how out of place she looked. She was still wearing the wrinkled navy trousers and blouse from 2 days ago. She felt unwashed, heavy, and deeply vulnerable. Dominic walked over, picking up the fallen pen and placing it on the table. He leaned over her shoulder to look at the screen. The proximity sent a wild jolt of electricity down her spine. "You're shaking," he observed, his deep voice vibrating right beside her ear. "I'm terrified," Taylor shot back, surprising herself with her own honesty. She finally turned her head to look at him. "I'm a hostage to a crime syndicate, Mr. Castiglione. I am tracing millions of dollars of dirty money. If I fail, you kill me. If I succeed, you probably still kill me to tie up loose ends. Excuse me if I don't have an appetite for sushi." Dominic's eyes narrowed, but there was no anger in them. Instead, a dangerous glimmer of amusement danced in the pale grey depths. He reached out his knuckles, brushing against her soft cheek. Taylor flinched, but he didn't pull away. "If I wanted you dead, Taylor, I would have left you in that parking garage," he said softly. "You view your size, your quietness as a weakness. Jonathan Hayes saw it as a weakness, but I see it as survival. You observe. You process. You survive." He pulled a chair out and sat beside her, invading her space completely. "Show me what you have." Forcing her heart rate to slow, Taylor pointed a trembling finger at the screen. Jonathan didn't act alone. The shell companies in the Caymans, the money wasn't just resting there, it was being systematically reinvested into a rival, legitimate business. Crescent Holdings. Dominic's posture went terrifyingly rigid. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Crescent," he whispered, the word laced with lethal intent. Crescent Holdings was the front company for the Moretti family, the Castiglione's oldest and most violent rivals in the city. "Jonathan wasn't just stealing from you to get rich," Taylor explained, her voice gaining a fraction of confidence as she leaned into her expertise. "He was funding your enemies. He used the money to quietly buy up the debt of your legitimate shipping warehouses in the Fulton Market District. If they default, the Morettis take legal possession of your territory." Dominic stood up abruptly, pacing toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. He looked out over the city, his jaw clenched so tightly she thought his teeth might shatter. "He sold us out from the inside." "I can reverse it," Taylor said quickly, desperation coloring her tone. She needed to prove her usefulness. "The transfers are still pending in an escrow account hidden behind a blind trust. I bypassed the firewall 2 hours ago. I have the routing numbers. If I trigger a false flag audit with the Federal Reserve, the funds will automatically bounce back to the original accounts. But I need your biometric authorization to initiate the recall." Dominic turned to look at her. The cold, dead eyes she had seen in the parking garage were completely gone, replaced by a blazing, predatory intensity. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, stopping right in front of her. He placed his hands on the armrests of her chair, boxing her in his face, inches from hers. Taylor's breath hitched. She felt small despite her size, entirely consumed by his dominant presence. "You are incredible," he murmured, his gaze dropping to her lips for a fraction of a second, before meeting her eyes again. Before Taylor could process the shocking compliment or the sudden terrifying flutter in her chest, the world exploded. A deafening crash shattered the silence as the massive reinforced double doors of the penthouse elevator lobby blew inward. Wood splinters and smoke billowed into the grand living room. Lorenzo, the stoic guard, shouted a warning right before a hail of suppressed gunfire cut him down. "Get down!" Dominic roared. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed Taylor by the waist, his strong arms easily lifting her heavy frame out of the chair, tackling her to the floor, just as a line of bullets shattered the mahogany table where she had been sitting a second before. The Morettis hadn't waited for the money to transfer. They had come to wipe out the Castiglione heir directly. Dominic dragged her behind the massive marble kitchen island, pulling a heavy matte black Glock from a holster at the small of his back. He pressed Taylor firmly against the floor, his body shielding hers. "Stay completely still," he ordered, racking the slide of his weapon. The cold, calculating Mafia boss was back, but as he looked down at her terrified, tear-streaked face, his grip on her shoulder tightened protectively. "I won't let them touch you, Penny. Do you hear me? Look at me." She looked into his pale eyes, the sound of boots crunching on broken glass, echoing in the hallway. "I've got you," he promised right as the first attacker rounded the corner. The first Moretti hitman rounded the corner of the destroyed elevator bank, his suppressed submachine gun sweeping the devastated living room. Dominic did not hesitate. From his crouched position behind the kitchen island, he fired twice. The deafening cracks of his Glock echoed through the high-vaulted penthouse, and the intruder collapsed, sliding across the polished Italian marble floor. "Move!" Dominic commanded, his voice a harsh rasp against Taylor's ear. He grabbed her hand, hauling her to her feet. Taylor's heart hammered against her ribcage like a trapped bird. Her heavy frame felt clumsy and sluggish compared to Dominic's lethal, feline grace, but adrenaline surged through her veins, overriding her paralyzing terror. She stumbled as they sprinted past the shattered remnants of the dining table, her sensible flats slipping on a scattering of bullet casings. Dominic's grip on her hand tightened physically, anchoring her to him, preventing her from falling. Gunfire erupted again, chewing through the drywall behind them. Dominic shoved Taylor through a concealed door disguised as a mahogany bookshelf in his private study. It clicked shut behind them instantly, muting the chaos outside. They were in a narrow, unlit service corridor that smelled heavily of dust and industrial lubricant. "Keep moving down the stairs." Dominic ordered, his breathing slightly elevated. He holstered his weapon and pulled a small, heavy flashlight from a utility panel on the wall, illuminating the steep, concrete stairwell. "This leads to the sub-basement. They won't know about it unless someone gave them the architectural blueprints." Taylor gripped the cold metal railing, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The descent was agonizing. Her thick thighs ached, and her lungs burned with every step. She was a woman who spent her life behind a desk, hidden beneath oversized sweaters, not running for her life in a darkened stairwell. "I can't," she wheezed, her foot catching on a step. She stumbled, her heavy body pitching forward into the darkness. Before she could hit the concrete, Dominic's strong arm wrapped around her waist, catching her entirely. He pulled her flush against his chest. Even in the freezing stairwell, he radiated an intense, overwhelming heat. "You can and you will," Dominic said fiercely, his pale grey eyes illuminated by the harsh beam of the flashlight. He did not look at her with pity or frustration. He looked at her with an absolute, terrifying certainty. You are stronger than you think, Taylor. You outsmarted Jonathan Hayes. You outsmarted the Moretti family accountants. You are not going to die on these stairs. I forbid it. His words sent a strange, powerful thrill through her. No one had ever spoken to her like that, like she was a vital, indispensable asset. Not a burden. Not the fat girl taking up too much space. She nodded, swallowing hard, and forced her legs to keep moving. They reached the sub-basement, 5 agonizing minutes later. Dominic kicked open a heavy fire door, leading them into a damp, dimly lit utility garage. A sleek, unassuming black sedan sat in the corner, covered in a thin layer of dust. Dominic smashed the driver's side window with the butt of his gun, reaching in to unlock the doors. "Get in the passenger seat. Keep your head down," he instructed, sliding behind the wheel. He didn't need keys. He reached under the steering column, his hands moving with practiced efficiency. Within seconds, the engine roared to life. They tore out of the utility garage, bursting onto the slick, rain-soaked pavement of Lower Wacker Drive. The subterranean labyrinth of concrete pillars and yellow sodium lights blurred past the windows. Taylor curled into the leather seat, clutching her knees to her chest. She glanced over at Dominic. The harsh street lights illuminated his sharp profile, but also revealed a dark, expanding stain on the left shoulder of his dress shirt. "You're bleeding," Taylor gasped, her eyes widening in horror. Dominic barely glanced at his shoulder. "A graze. It doesn't matter. Open the glove box." Taylor obeyed, her trembling fingers fumbling with the latch. Inside was a heavy military-grade encrypted tablet. "The escrow transfer," Dominic said, steering the car with one hand as they wove recklessly through the underground traffic. "You said you needed my biometric authorization to bounce the funds back from Crescent Holdings. Do it now." Taylor pulled the tablet onto her lap. The screen flared to life, demanding a password. Dominic recited a complex string of alphanumeric codes without looking away from the road. Taylor's fingers flew across the digital keyboard. This was her domain. Amidst the gunfire and the blood, the numbers made sense. She bypassed the secondary firewall, accessing the hidden routing nodes she had discovered back at the penthouse. The $4 million was still sitting in the blind trust, 30 minutes away from clearing into Vincent Moretti's offshore accounts. "I have it," Taylor said, her voice steadying. "I'm initiating the false flag with the Federal Reserve." A prompt appeared on the screen, blinking ominously in red biometric override required. Dominic shoved his bleeding right hand toward her, keeping his left hand firmly on the steering wheel. Taylor took his hand. His skin was rough, calloused, and uncomfortably warm. She pressed his thumb against the tablet scanner. The screen flashed a brilliant green. Transfer reversed. Funds rerouted. "It's done," Taylor breathed, staring at the screen. "The money is back in your accounts. Crescent Holdings is over-leveraged. When the morning bell rings, the Moretti family will default on their Fulton Market loans. They are entirely bankrupt." Dominic let out a low, dark laugh that vibrated through the small cabin of the car. He looked over at her, his pale eyes burning with a mixture of adrenaline and raw admiration. "Vincent Moretti sent a hit squad to take my life," Dominic murmured, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. "And in return, a beautiful accountant just destroyed his entire empire from the passenger seat of a stolen car. Checkmate." Taylor flushed deeply, her heart doing a violent flutter at the word beautiful. She looked down at her hands, acutely aware of the blood smudged on her fingertips. "Where are we going?" "Oak Park," Dominic replied, his tone softening slightly. "I have a secure property there. Unlisted. Safe." The safe house in Oak Park was a stark contrast to the towering glass-encased penthouse. It was a historic, sprawling Victorian home, completely hidden behind thick wrought-iron gates and towering oak trees. Inside it was quiet, smelling of old paper and polished wood. Dominic locked the heavy front door behind them, throwing the deadbolts. He took 2 steps into the foyer before his knees suddenly buckled. "Dominic," Taylor cried out, rushing forward to catch him. His massive weight pressed heavily against her, but her solid frame held firm. She wrapped her arms around his waist, supporting him, as he groaned, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving the brutal reality of the gunshot wound behind. "Kitchen," he grunted, leaning heavily on her. Taylor practically dragged the feared syndicate boss down the hallway and into a large farmhouse-style kitchen. She eased him onto a wooden chair. "I need to look at it. You need a doctor." "No doctors," Dominic growled, resting his head back against the chair. "There is a medical kit under the sink. Bring it to me." Taylor scrambled to find the kit, pulling out a heavy red box filled with gauze, antiseptic, and surgical tools. She returned to his side. Her hands were shaking again, but she forced herself to focus. "I have to take your shirt off." Dominic gave a short, breathless chuckle. "Buy me a drink first, Penny." Despite the terror of the night, a small smile ghosted across Taylor's lips. She carefully unbuttoned his ruined black shirt, peeling the fabric away from his skin. His torso was violently beautiful, sculpted muscle, marred by a constellation of faded scars, telling the silent history of a violently lived life. The bullet had grazed the fleshy part of his shoulder, tearing a deep, bloody groove, but thankfully it had not shattered the collarbone. She cleaned the wound with trembling hands, wincing as Dominic hissed in pain when the antiseptic hit the raw flesh. As she worked, leaning intimately close to him, she felt his pale eyes watching her intently. "Why didn't you run?" Dominic asked softly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence of the kitchen. "In the parking garage, when I turned my back. You could have run." Taylor secured a thick white bandage over his shoulder, stepping back slightly to create some desperately needed space between them. "I'm not built for running, Mr. Castiglione. I thought we established that on the stairs." "Dominic," he corrected her, reaching out to gently catch her wrist, preventing her from stepping completely away. "My name is Dominic." "Dominic." She repeated the name, tasting foreign and dangerous on her tongue. "I didn't run because I knew I wouldn't get far, and because for the first time in my life, someone actually saw me. Jonathan only saw a naive, overweight girl he could frame. The partners at my firm only saw a workhorse. You looked at me and saw someone useful." "I saw more than that," Dominic murmured. He tugged gently on her wrist, pulling her back toward him. He pulled her until she was standing between his parted legs, practically flush against him. Taylor's breath hitched. She instinctively tried to cross her arms over her soft stomach, deeply ashamed of her size, of how much space she took up in his presence. "Don't," she whispered, her cheeks burning. "Please don't mock me." Dominic's expression darkened. He let go of her wrist instead, placing both of his large, calloused hands on her wide hips. His grip was firm, possessive, and entirely unapologetic. "Mock you?" He repeated, his tone laced with genuine disbelief. "Look at me, Taylor." She kept her eyes firmly on the wooden floorboards. "Look at me," he commanded. Again, the same authoritative rumble from the parking garage. But this time, it was laced with a strange, dark affection. She slowly raised her eyes to meet his. "You saved my life tonight. You saved my legacy." Dominic said, his thumbs tracing slow, deliberate circles against her hips, sending waves of heat through her body. "You think I care about the standards of a society that forces you to hide your brilliance? You are soft, Taylor. You are real. You are the smartest, bravest woman I have ever met. I don't want a fragile porcelain doll. I want a queen who can stand beside me when the empire burns." Tears welled up in Taylor's eyes, spilling hotly over her cheeks. She had spent 26 years apologizing for her body, apologizing for her existence. And here, covered in blood and dust in a hidden safe house, Chicago's most dangerous man was holding her as if she was the most precious thing in the world. Dominic reached up, wiping a tear from her cheek with his thumb. He leaned forward, his face inches from hers. "You can never go back to Faulkner and Reed Financial. Jonathan is dead. The FBI will be tearing that office apart by dawn. You belong to the shadows now, Penny. You belong to me." He didn't ask for permission. He pulled her down, capturing her lips in a bruising, desperate kiss. It tasted of copper and adrenaline, a collision of two entirely different worlds. Taylor melted against him, her soft curves pressing into his hard angles. She tangled her fingers in his dark hair, surrendering completely to the terrifying, intoxicating reality of her new life. She was no longer the invisible auditor in Cubicle 4B. She was the woman who broke the Moretti family. She was Taylor Gallagher, the untouchable queen of the Castiglione syndicate. And as Dominic pulled her closer, burying his face in the crook of her neck, Taylor knew she would never hide in the shadows again. She had learned to rule them. Did Taylor and Dominic's thrilling escape leave you breathless? If you loved this intense Mafia romance, hit that like button and share this video with your friends who crave dark, pulse-pounding drama. Please do not forget to subscribe to our channel